This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. If all the news out of Washington has made this week feel like a blur, well, I can relate. But today is Friday. Time to try and make sense of it all in this week's Friday News Roundup.
I have no deals in Russia. I have no deals that could happen in Russia.
Shooter Dylan Roof has been sentenced to death. The jury came back with the death sentence.
Came to the conclusion a few years ago that the risk of climate change does exist and that the consequences of it could be serious enough that action should be taken.
The Chargers are moving to Los Angeles, ending a 55-year run in the city of San Diego.
I do have one final ask of you as your president. The same thing I asked when you took a chance on me 8 years ago. I'm asking you to believe, not in my ability to bring about change, but in yours.
We have a lot to talk about and three great reporters to help us through it. Joining us here in studio are Major Garrett, the chief White House correspondent for CBS News. Major, welcome to 1A.
Great to be with you.
Susan Glasser is the chief international affairs columnist at Politico. Susan, glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And Jeff Mason is White House correspondent for Reuters. Jeff, welcome.
Great to be here, Joshua.
Feel free to send in your questions about this week's top national news. Email us 1a@wamu.org. Comment on our Facebook page. Tweet us at 1A. And you can watch the live stream of this broadcast online at the1a.org. That's the word the number one, the letter A.org. I wore a nice tie just for the occasion. Let's begin with the ongoing controversy about what information Russia may or may not have about President-elect Donald Trump. Jeff Mason, walk us through what's happened so far and where things stand right now.
So this was a big story this week that sort of erupted on Tuesday when BuzzFeed and CNN respectively reported, and not in that order, that Russia had perhaps that, let me start that over, that Donald Trump and that the president and vice president had been briefed about information that Russia had that may have been compromising about the president-elect. And then BuzzFeed proceeded to distribute or publish the information, this unsubstantiated memo that talked about some of these claims, which were pretty salacious. And that spilled into then a lot of very negative reaction from the Trump team, from Donald Trump himself, both on Twitter and then in his fairly chaotic press conference the following day on Wednesday, in which he called CNN a fake news provider and was very critical of BuzzFeed as well.
Now, we should be very clear that no news organization has independently verified the content of this report. BuzzFeed published the document. What it says is the document. We don't even know if that is the document or who the person is. All the details are very sketchy, and most news organizations have hedged far, far away from talking about anything that was in this file that dropped online.
That's
right,
true.
It's important to point out that what CNN did was to say, and the news hook for its original report was that this information, unsubstantiated, had been briefed to the vice president, the president, and the president-elect. And that CNN declared in a cautious story about all of this that didn't go into very many of the details of what was in this 35-page compilation of unverified and unsubstantiated rumors circulating around Moscow about Trump, was, hey, this was briefed to the incoming president and the current president and vice president, and that in itself is a news item. And that was CNN's journalistic approach to the story. BuzzFeed then took this to a completely different level. One I am not comfortable with as a journalist, and one I've already said that if I had worked at BuzzFeed, I would have laid my job on the line to prevent. Because nobody knows what the motivations behind this were. Nobody knows if any of it's true, verifiable in any context, and yet BuzzFeed threw it out there under the general umbrella defense of, hey, it's out there. People in Washington have seen it. The public has a right to know.
Make up your own mind.
And my journalistic sensibility on that is not a defensible standard for journalists.
Could I ask, I wonder, and you're right, there's no real way for us to know exactly whether these things are true, but now it's part of the political conversation. It's now out there. Donald Trump addressed it during the news conference on Wednesday. Susan, what do you make of how this is all playing out politically and how this might play out in the weeks to come?
Well, look, I'm glad you framed it up that way because I think in terms of the politics of it, right, where you see once again that Trump has managed to use sort of the jujitsu. Here we are having a conversation not about the unbelievably serious and unprecedented allegations that Russia intervened in the United States election in the most serious way that we've seen, but another conversation about the media and what are the standards for publishing news in the internet era. How does information get out? We're literally having a debate over that instead of the unanimous conclusion of the United States' 17 intelligence agencies that Russia systematically intervened to influence the outcome of the United States election on behalf of Donald Trump. And so to me, that's a great example of the new political reality that we're living in, first of all. And it also shows Trump's skill. As a politician, this is the thing I think that he's very best at, actually, is this form of jujitsu in being able to successfully identify and seize the narrative. He's done it once again this morning. He's up tweeting, attacking Hillary Clinton again, criticizing the investigation, which I'm sure we'll talk about, into FBI Director Jim Comey's behavior during the election campaign. So, Trump is really a master at this on the one hand. On the other hand, as someone who lived in Russia for 4 years as a correspondent, I can say that this kind of allegation, the idea that the Russian government potentially would be unearthing what we call compromat, compromising information on U.S. political figures, of course, is absolutely central to the MO of the Russian intelligence agencies, and they have been used with great success in actually influencing outcomes, the systematic leaking of this kind of information inside Russian politics, internally in Eastern European countries and in other places that Russia is seeking to wield influence.
That's Susan Glasser of Politico. We're also speaking with Major Garrett of CBS News and Jeff Mason of Reuters today on the Friday News Roundup's U.S. edition. We'd love to hear your questions and thoughts about the week's news. Email us 1a@wamu.org, tweet us @1a, or find us on Facebook. This page is facebook.com/the1a show.
And just if I could jump in and pick up on a point that Susan made that I really think is important. And I spent 16 months on the road covering the Trump campaign. I will be covering the Trump presidency. And if I could say there's one great challenge, and there are many, but if there is one great overwhelming challenge about covering Donald Trump, it's distilling that which is most important at that moment. Because so many things come at you in so many different ways. And viewed from a more distant perspective, to Susan's underlying point, this two-page addendum handed off as a part of this larger presentation to President-elect Trump about the systematic effort of Russia to hack in the 2016 election might have been the best thing that happened to him this week. It makes him a victim. It creates a complete different narrative about something that's completely different from other topics that could have bedeviled his approach to Inauguration Day 1 week from today. Namely, how are you going to separate yourself from your business? What was the import and the long-term strategic implications of Russia's hacking into the election? The Affordable Care Act now being legislatively dismantled piece by piece, starting in the Senate, now the House. Lots of other issues could have been problematic for this incoming administration, almost to a complete degree wiped off, if not wiped off, diminished in relative coverage and conversation to this other issue. And I think I felt this continuously covering Donald Trump. How do you distill that which is most important from that which is most interesting? Well, and sometimes they are not the same thing.
Well, he did. I'm glad you brought up the business ties. He did address some of that. We did get a clearer airing of what exactly happened with his business ties earlier this week. Here's a clip of Donald Trump talking about the concerns that his massive business empire might create something of a conflict of interest.
I have a no conflict of interest provision as president. It was many, many years old. This is for presidents, because they don't want presidents getting, I understand, they don't want presidents getting tangled up in minutia. They want a president to run the country. So I could actually run my business. I could actually run my business and run government at the same time. I don't like the way that looks, but I would be able to do that if I wanted to. I'd be the only one that would be able to do that. You can't do that in any other capacity. But as a president, I could run the Trump Organization, great company, and I could run the country. I do a very good job, but I don't want to do that.
Mr. Trump says he's going to hand over his business to a trust. It'll be run by his sons, Donald Jr. and Eric. There will be an ethics overseer to monitor all the business ties and make sure that he stays far away from it. We're coming up on a break, but Jeff Mason, how much, if at all, did that quell concerns about the potential entanglement between Donald Trump and the White House?
Well, it didn't quell concerns among ethics watchdogs. He said it wasn't enough. He did bring up his tax attorney during that press conference, which was another kind of somewhat bizarre moment in the middle of this chaotic news era to bring up somebody and give sort of a dry recitation of how he was going to disentangle himself from his business. But people are still concerned and say that it's not enough. And it's also interesting that just less than a week or about a week now before his inauguration that he's still clearly very involved in his business, because he said he had just turned down a $2 billion deal in Dubai. So clearly, as he is giving or trying to show the country that he is removing himself from that and handing over control to his sons, he's still pretty involved.
That's Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. We're also spending the hour with Susan Glasser, Chief International Affairs columnist at Politico, Major Garrett, the Chief White House correspondent for CBS News, and with you. We look forward to hearing more of your questions and comments about the week's news. We'll continue talking about it on the other side. Major, you're right. There is way too much to get to this week. We'll do the best we can in the time that we have left. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Inada, Japanese maker of full-body massage chairs, including the Flex 3S with pre-programmed shiatsu massages and full-body stretch sessions at inadausa.com. That's INADAUSA.com. From 3M Health Information Systems and Verily, working to improve insights and outcomes across health delivery systems and patient populations. Learn more at 3m.com/pophealth. And from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This is the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup on 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to have you with us. Today we're speaking with Major Garrett of CBS News, Susan Glasser of Politico, and Jeff Mason of Reuters, also live streaming video at the1a.org. That's the word the number 1, the letter A.org. Let's try to get through as much of the week's news as we can and get to as many questions as we can. As we said, there's a lot to talk about, including the recent announcement that the Justice Department's Inspector General will be looking into the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton that came during the campaign cycle. Susan Glasser, this seems highly unprecedented, and it seems like it addresses a concern that just the fact that FBI Director James Comey said anything during the election might have affected the election.
Well, look, let's say, we're so overwhelmed with news, it bears noting that in any other context, this would be red siren flashing, huge, massive banner front page headlines, enormous scandal gripping the country level of story. The idea that the Justice Department's Inspector General is investigating the FBI, the New York Times, the FBI director, New York Times pointed out, it has happened before, but very, very rarely in American politics, and never in the context not only of an American presidential election, but one in which there are real beliefs, including on the part of the Clinton campaign, that the FBI director's actions actually affected the outcome of the United States presidency. That is what makes this so unprecedented. It's the reason that, you have Donald Trump's Twitter storm again early this morning attacking Hillary Clinton, because it goes straight to the question of whether not only was the U.S. presidential election potentially hacked and intervened in from abroad by the Russians, but that potentially one of our own institutions of government acted inappropriately to influence the outcome. And that is really what this investigation goes right to the question of. We don't know what kind of an investigation it will be, how long it will last, what kind of conclusions it will lead to. It appears at the moment, certainly, that it's not any kind of criminal investigation. That's outside of the, sort of scope and power of the Inspector General, who could then recommend further investigation by those who conduct criminal investigations. But in this case, it would be looking at violations of Justice Department guidelines and the like, which Democrats have very strongly, and independent observers, including a number of Republicans, said even in the middle of the campaign that the Justice Department's own guidelines appear to be violated by the conduct of the FBI director.
It also occurs to me, Major, that the intelligence community writ large right now is very much in the spotlight, and this is just another part of it. Like, I don't know how many Americans would have known before this week or last week that there were 17 intelligence agencies, or what they did or where they were. Right. It's just, it feels like there's this larger conversation, and it came up during the confirmation hearings too, which we'll get to shortly. But now the nation is talking about the intelligence community overall, what it's made of, how it works, its relationship to the president, and whether or not, or how it will factor into the Trump administration going forward.
Sure, that dispute is now very open between the president-elect and the intelligence community. There is some sense that once President-elect Trump becomes president and his people are confirmed, then things will calm down a little bit, at least at the leadership level. But as any president has learned, just because you have your own people at the leadership level doesn't mean you might not have problems with those at the underlying level of any of these intelligence agencies. But to Director Comey, this is really about, should you have spoken, and should you have spoken the way you spoke to Congress and to the public in July, saying there should be no charges against Hillary Clinton, but going through this very elaborate sort of near prosecutorial rhetoric about what she should not have done. Protocol says you don't say anything. When there's not a prosecution, you don't say anything. You don't even issue a release other than there's no prosecution, and maybe not even that. Should you send the 2 letters in the tail end of the campaign about the Anthony Weiner, Huma Abedin emails might be relevant, then no, then they're not. And then to this week, it sort of brought it to a head when Democrats talking to Comey at a testimony before the Senate said, well, are you investigating anything about Russia's attempts to compromise the president-elect or anyone on his team? Oh, I could never comment on a potential investigation. You could almost hear the thunder exploding in the minds of Democrats saying, what? You can't comment?
Now you can't comment.
Now? What? Suddenly this daintiness and adherence to protocol where they feel that protocol was, if not grotesquely violated, was violated in a way that had a political echo effect, and a negative one for Hillary Clinton. Comey has to defend that. His reputation is out there. There is a Wall Street Journal columnist today, Kimberly Strassel, saying, resign or get fired because you no longer have, as FBI director, the confidence of the American public, Republicans, or Democrats, and possibly not even this incoming administration.
Let's keep moving on. Let's talk about Obamacare. Yesterday, the Senate passed a bill to make it easier to repeal Obamacare. The House plans to take it up today. Last night, in a CNN town hall, House Speaker Paul Ryan said the plan is to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something else at the same time. President-elect Trump, during his news conference this week, said much the same thing.
We're going to be submitting a plan. It'll be repeal and replace It will be essentially simultaneously. It will be various segments, you understand, but will most likely be on the same day or the same week, but probably the same day, could be the same hour. So we're going to do repeal and replace, very complicated stuff. And we're going to get a health bill passed. We're going to get health care taken care of in this country.
A lot of comments on the Affordable Care Act from you listening to us right now. Rick emailed us, please discuss why the Republicans held the House and the Senate for 6 years, and spent that whole time attempting to repeal the ACA, but did nothing to develop a health plan of their own. Virginia, here in Washington, emailed us, discuss the recent polls that show Trump supporters do not want the ACA repealed and did not know that it expanded coverage for millions of previously uninsured. Jeff Mason, it seems like now there's this moment of reckoning where people are starting to realize, A, what the Affordable Care Act really did, B, what repeal actually means, and C, getting their heads around the complexity of what it would take to repeal or replace any piece of it, let alone all of it.
For sure. I think one of the more interesting words that came out of President-elect Trump's comments just there were, this is very complicated stuff. And that is true. If they are going to come up with a replacement, if they repeal and replace really at the same time, then I think everyone's really eager to see that replacement, particularly Democrats. And President Obama has made a very concerted push in his final weeks in office to encourage Democrats to stand up for the Affordable Care Act. And if they're not able to save it, which they almost certainly won't be able to, then to give ownership to the Republicans for everything that comes as a result of getting rid of that act.
You broke it, you bought it, basically.
You broke it, you bought it. Now, how are you going to fix it?
Is there anyone coming up with a leading plan? I mean, I heard Paul Ryan speaking on the town hall last night, and it was great to hear him kind of lay it out in detail, the argument, and hear what the statistics are, and this is what I would like us to do, and here's why, and here's what it would do. And I think that's like one of the few really clear airings on a national stage that I've heard of any Republican lawmaker saying in detail, here's our argument, here's the plan, here's what it would do. But practically on Capitol Hill, who is the leading voice right now with the plan of what to do? Major?
So the listener said, where's the plan? And it's a very good question. And the answer to that is there are plans, but there is no consensus plan. The most elaborate and detailed plan written to replace the Affordable Care Act was authored by Tom Price, congressman from Georgia, now the designee to be Secretary of HHS, Health and Human Services, the lead agency supervising the emplacement of the Affordable Care Act. His legislation was his and his alone. It never got a consensus within the House Republican Conference and never got anywhere close to a consensus among Senate Republicans. But at that same press conference, President-elect Trump said, that plan is really going to start moving once my HHS secretary is confirmed, implying that Price's legislation may be his opening bid on that. There are a lot of underlying details with that Republicans are uncomfortable with. I can go into some detail on it if you want to, but the fact of the matter is there is no consensus political document, legislative and political, and they're both important, to replace the Affordable Care Act. And until that is achieved, President-elect Trump can promise all he wants about near simultaneous, same hour, same day, same week. It's all malarkey.
Is there any?
You cannot do it.
Is there anyone particular?
You cannot find the votes to replace it. You can certainly find the votes to repeal it, no question. And that process has begun in earnest. But the votes to replace it do not exist because the underlying consensus doesn't exist.
Is there any one particular detail of the Affordable Care Act that's particularly thorny in
well,
terms
there are
of finding
lots
a
of
consensus?
them, but let's just talk about Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. Under the Price approach, you would give a lump sum to states and let them deal with it as they would. Innovate Medicaid however they want to. Some governors want that responsibility. Many other governors, some and Republican, don't want that responsibility and all the political hassles that come with it. Plus, it won't be as generous as what the federal government is providing now. So on Medicaid expansion, one area right there. The other one is if you have you can have your pre-existing conditions covered, but if any time there is a slippage, a gap in your coverage, you fall back out, you're not guaranteed, and whatever coverage you do get would be more costly and possibly less generous than under the Affordable Care Act. Those are just two elements of the Price plan that have political difficulties wrapped around them.
Susan, where does this leave us politically? Does this mean that we're gridlocked in Congress until we figure out a consensus plan, or does life kind of go on?
Well, I think that's what's so striking about Congress's decision to move forward so rapidly this week, because basically this point about it's all malarkey, where Trump is saying he's going to replace it at the same time he's repealing it, that's already not true. They are already moving this week, even before Obama has left office and Trump has come in. Congress has made a decision to move ahead with the actions that set in motion the legislative repeal of the act. And so I think their timetable is already bifurcated, number one. That's a political fact at this point. And you see that there's still ingrained habits of running against Obamacare because that's just a lot easier to do politically. You had Trump just this morning, I believe, tweeting out again, and don't worry, we're going to get rid of the Unaffordable Care Act, as I call it. And, that's a campaign promise that they'll find easier to deliver than replacing it, number one. Number two, remember the lesson of Obama's first 100 days and the beginning of his presidency, where there was a decision taken inside the White House that proved to be controversial, and maybe it was the right decision, maybe it wasn't, to pursue healthcare reform at the expense of other legislative priorities. In effect, this has now become the first major, at least on domestic policy, decision of the Trump administration. So for two successive presidencies coming from very different points of view, you now have them deciding basically, okay, we're going to be overwhelmed and have to focus politically all of our efforts on figuring out what replaces Obamacare. And I think, that may or may not prove to be the wise decision politically, and it probably will overshadow a lot of other potential priorities.
Let's get to a few audience questions. Ed McKinney tweeted us, why is there no serious consideration by Congress to invalidate the results of the election because of Russian interference? What would that take?
Well, because the consensus of the intelligence community is that there was an attempt, there was infiltration, there was dissemination of information, but there was no hacking of machinery. There was nothing in the procedural conduct of the election that was either tampered with, harmed, or undermined by any of these Russian attempts. That it was informational and therefore relevant, but not destructive of the underlying process itself. Therefore, no basis to invalidate that which occurred. Lots of things were discussed. The intelligence community said this was one of them. Was it helpful to Hillary Clinton? Probably not. But in the end, the actual carrying out of the election from a mechanical point of view was not harmed.
Not to mention the fact, politically, you've got a Republican-controlled Congress, which is very pleased to see a Republican having won the White House.
We also got a tweet. J. Lloyd tweeted us, the left lost because of terrible Democratic candidate, not because of Russia. Kokomo Kid tweeted us, I love your Twitter handle, Kokomo Kid 1, so as not to be confused with the other Kokomo Kid that we all know. Kokomo Kid 1 tweeted us, Trump said he has no dealings in or with Russia. Is that not a bold-faced lie?
Well, it's hard to answer some of those part of that question because we don't have his tax returns, and that was one of the myriad of issues that came up again at the press conference this week. And he said that it's only reporters who are interested in seeing those tax returns, not the American public. And he won the election, so he doesn't need to release them. But there is no doubt a minefield of financial information in those returns that would answer questions about whether he has financial dealings in Russia or anywhere else in the world.
And by the way, we should say that one of his sons was quoted as saying in an article a few years ago that there was, in fact, a flood of money coming into the Trump organization from Russians.
Let's shift gears a little bit to the outgoing president. President Barack Obama gave his goodbye this week in Chicago to a very large crowd of supporters, a lot of former staffers. Of course, his family was there. Joe Biden was there. This is what he said at the very end of what became a somewhat emotional and tearful farewell.
But for now, whether you are young or whether you're young at heart, I do have one final ask of you as your president. The same thing I asked when you took a chance on me 8 years ago. I'm asking you to believe, not in my ability to bring about change, but in yours. I'm asking you to hold fast to that faith written into our founding documents, that idea whispered by slaves and abolitionists, that spirit sung by immigrants and homesteaders and those who marched for justice, that creed reaffirmed by those who planted flags from foreign battlefields to the surface of the moon. a creed at the core of every American whose story is not yet written. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you. May God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Major Garrett, what was your reaction to President Obama's farewell?
So I thought there was a couple of components of the speech that were in the middle that I think over time we may look back on as either markers laid down by an outgoing president that were prescient or that were just simply bedeviling him at the end of his 8 years. One is we have to get to a place or return to a place, not where we agree, but we agree on some basic either scientific facts or discernible, provable facts. Argue about their implications, argue about our political orientation, but stop hiving ourselves off through social media or other forms of news gathering in which we are constantly, relentlessly pleased by our own self-reinforcement of our own ideology. And for a president to say this is a problem for the future of our own democracy, which the president said in his address, I think is extremely important for a man of his power and his sensitivity to the way issues are discussed and the media comes at him at this most powerful place in American political life. The other thing he mentioned is automation can exacerbate and possibly make more difficult these underlying economic separations of wealthy and not wealthy in our country, and it's a huge issue we're going to have to grapple with. And if you're thinking it's trading partners, you may not be right. You may have to spend much more time thinking about the implications of automation on the workplace, wages, and jobs. I thought those two things may resonate over the years.
Love to get some more reaction on the other side of the break as we continue with the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup with Major Garrett of CBS News, Susan Glasser of Politico, Jeff Mason of Reuters, and you. There's still plenty to talk about. We haven't even gotten to the confirmation hearings yet. We haven't gotten to something that's very close to Major's heart. We'll see if we can get him to come out of his shell a little bit and talk about the San Diego Chargers on the other side of this break. Stay close. I'm Joshua Johnson. Next hour on 1A, our news roundup continues. We'll discuss why America putting troops in Poland has not gone over well with Russia, whether Russia and Iran are behind a resurgent Taliban in Afghanistan, and the strange thing that is happening to radio in Norway. That's next hour on 1A.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from the estate of Brenna and Irving Sissenwine, supporting the collaborative news-gathering model of NPR and member station newsrooms, which seek to create a network that reflects and illuminates the fabric of America. From Audible, provider of audiobooks performed by narrators such as Emma Thompson, James Franco, Alan Cumming, and others. More at audible.com/listen. Audible, stories that surround you. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
Before we get back to the Friday News Roundup, we're hard at work on next week's shows, and we'd love your help with something coming up early next week. The First Lady is an unofficial position, but it's played an influential role in many presidential administrations. How has a First Lady influenced you, personally? Perhaps it was her example as a wife or a mother, her advocacy on certain issues, her personal sense of style, her politics, or maybe something else. And yes, we are asking everyone this regardless of gender. Tell us your story. Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. How has a first lady, any first lady, past or present, influenced you personally? 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also email us a voice memo to 1A@WAMU.org. Let's continue now with our Friday News Roundup with Jeff Mason of Reuters, Susan Glasser of Politico, and Major Garrett of CBS News. Before the break, we were talking about President Obama's legacy. Jeff, what do you make of the speech and his legacy?
So I was there for the speech on Tuesday night, and it was emotional. It was really kind of interesting to see all of the old and current White House and campaign staff come together, and they were certainly energized and nostalgic about the last weeks and days of the Obama presidency. I thought some of the things that really stood out to me about his speech were he said that the U.S. needs to guard against the decline of values and of U.S. values and values that he said he had sort of lifted up during his presidency. That seemed like a knock against Trump. And there were some others. He said specifically, I reject discrimination against Muslim Americans. That doesn't need to be in your going away speech unless you think that's a concern, and he clearly does. He said science and reason matter. He said, and this was sort of a political point, he said the idea of a post-racial America was never going to happen with my election, he said. But he also talked about connecting the struggle for justice for African Americans and racial minorities to the middle-aged white guy. And that was clearly a reference to one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton and Democrats probably lost in 2016 was not enough outreach to that particular demographic. So he mixed in some messages for Trump and for the country and for his supporters in that going away speech that ended up with a pretty teary farewell from a guy who's normally pretty stoic.
We got plenty more to get through in this week's news, but let me get to one email about something we discussed earlier in the show. Julia had a question about the investigation into the FBI and its investigation of Hillary Clinton. Julia emailed us, where's the investigation of Rudolph Giuliani in relation to this? He said 2 days before Comey's statement that something big was coming. Is that on the radar at all? Or has that kind of fallen away? Susan?
Well, it's entirely possible that that would fall within the scope of this investigation that, after all, has just been announced this week and is just getting going from the Inspector General. It certainly would be within their purview to look at any allegations that might arise from the question of Comey and his team's conduct. And there have been allegations of potential collusion or contacts between FBI officials and Trump campaign officials like Giuliani. That would be, it seems to me, potentially within the scope of this investigation.
And there were also questions about contacts between the Justice Department officials and some in the Clinton campaign.
Yes.
And here's an interesting aspect of this story. Newly minted legislation, signed by President Obama, written by congressional Republicans, increases the power of the Inspector General to collect any and all relevant documents. Executive privilege and other matters that had previously kept certain aspects of IG investigations off limits are no longer operative. So, if this investigation wants to go, as the cliche goes, to the mattresses, it is now legally authorized to do so.
Let's go back a bit in the week and talk about, really all week, and talk about some of the confirmation hearings for members of Donald Trump's cabinet. This week, we heard from the nominee for Attorney General, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, for Homeland Security, General John Kelly, for Secretary of State, former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, for Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, who had been the Labor Secretary, for Defense Secretary General James Mattis, for Housing and Urban Development Secretary Dr. Ben Carson, and for CIA Director Republican Congressman Mike Pompeo of Kansas. This is partly why it felt like
laundry list time.
Exactly,
yes,
why
absolutely.
it felt like such a busy week. Susan, what do you make of this overall? Good week for the nominees so far, bad week? Certainly interesting with some of the statements they made that contradict some things that President-elect Trump has said.
Well, that's right. So there's two main sort of storylines emerging from this. On the one hand, there are this issue of the contradictions between Trump's very forcefully stated public positions on a number of issues, such as allowing torture, building the wall with Mexico, whether or not we should have a much friendlier relationship with Russia. In all of those cases, his nominees have contradicted him in some ways that suggest this is going to be a very interesting administration when they actually sit down and start to talk to each other about things. So there's that bucket of issues, which is worth talking about at some length. However, there's also the political facts, which are that no major new impediments to the confirmation of really most of these people emerged in the course of this. There were no major new gaffes, even in instances where these nominees were contradicting the president. For example, General Mattis clearly is a very strong believer in NATO. He was a former senior official of NATO, so it's perhaps not a surprise. The new CIA director is contradicting the president and saying, I will not allow torture to take place on my watch, and that includes waterboarding. Trump, as you know, disagrees with that. Even the new Homeland Security nominee saying, well, the wall in and of itself really isn't going to do anything, and you have to have a much more layered, nuanced defense. So, on the one hand, you have these contradictions, but you didn't see the politics shift at all. And, the bottom line is that the Republicans have the votes to approve these nominees, and it looks as though that is very much what's going to happen.
So then let's carry this forward. Suppose these nominees get confirmed, as they are, with the views that they've already espoused. Talk about what that means on a working relationship basis, Jeff, where you have people like Rex Tillerson who say that he does understand that climate change has human causes, even though Donald Trump has expressed some real skepticism about that. Where you have a number of the nominees who say torture is illegal. I will not consent to waterboarding under any circumstances. Where you have a number of policy areas where they may end up face to face in the Oval Office saying, look, I know I serve at your pleasure, Mr. President, but you're flat out wrong on this one. I'm sorry, you're incorrect. What does that mean in terms of the day-to-day working relationship of the president? Does this mean that ultimately they just have to roll over and do what the president says? Or does this mean maybe that some of the views that more mainstream Republicans have could end up in the administration's policy?
I think, number one, it's going to make for some very interesting cabinet meetings in the cabinet room at the White House. I think it raises the question of whether some of the issues that President-elect Trump espoused during the campaign are issues on which he is flexible or not. And you've certainly seen, even in the just early days after his election, him walking back from some of them. You saw that even on Obamacare, although he's hardened his position a little bit more since then. But in his initial meeting with President Obama in the Oval Office, which lasted about 90 minutes, as I recall, he came away after hearing from the current president with more admiration for some of the aspects of that law. So will that same effect happen with members of his cabinet? My guess is yes, he chose these people. He knows their views. He's been nothing but complimentary about them, and he has said that he thinks this will be the strongest cabinet in all of U.S. history. So he's probably not expecting to have a cabinet of people who won't stand up for what they believe in. That said, one of the reasons he was elected and one of the reasons he has a big grassroots support base is because of the views that he has espoused.
One story in the news that seemed to dovetail with some issues that came up in the cabinet hearing had to do with the incoming Attorney General, the nominee, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, and how the Department of Justice deals with racially motivated hate crimes or crimes against LGBT people. This week, we had the sentencing of Dylan Roof. A federal judge in South Carolina formally sentenced him to die on Wednesday for a hate-motivated murder in 2015. Roof killed a group of worshipers at a midweek Bible study inside a historically black church in Charleston. Mr. Roof has made it very clear that he is not the least bit sorry for what he did and that he did it to start a race war. I wonder, Major, in light of the fact that you had civil rights legends like Congressman John Lewis stand up and say, this is not the guy for this job. Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey, testified against a fellow senator, which has never happened in U.S. history. And this concern about Jeff Sessions' record on civil rights. Suppose he gets confirmed. We have just had the very first such conviction under federal hate crime laws. Just because he supports those laws doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be racing to do all of these prosecutions. What might that mean going forward?
Well, Part of that depends on circumstances, things presented to the Justice Department. What do you prioritize? What do you emphasize? What do you not? And I would argue that in Cory Booker's case, part of that was introducing himself as a possible presidential candidate 4 years from now. And the other criticism of Jeff Sessions along these issues related to civil rights, I think, is a precursor to what Democrats will do once President Trump, as he said at this press conference when I asked him about it, puts up his nominee to the Supreme Court 2 weeks after Inauguration Day. That's the timeline he set before the country. I really do think the Jeff Sessions confirmation hearing process is a warm-up for the Supreme Court confirmation process, laying a predicate down on all of these issues, identifying them first for the public, reinforcing their centrality to the American experience as for the Justice Department, are a long journey from Jim Crow, from slavery to Jim Crow to equal rights under the law for all concerned, and make that a sort of foundational argument for whomever President Trump puts up on the Supreme Court. And I think that's the Democrats' point of view on this and why they use the Jeff Sessions confirmation hearing as a springboard to that larger debate that's going to inevitably come on the Supreme Court question, because there they have more of a political toehold on the confirmation process than they do with a narrow majority that can already and will approve Jeff Sessions as the next Attorney General.
Can I stick with you, Major, for a story that I know you absolutely do not care about whatsoever? You might have cared on another day, but certainly not today. And I'm not expecting him to have any opinions on this. So, Susan and Jeff, this will probably fall to you, but we'll give Major a shot.
Okay. Awesome.
Yesterday, the San Diego Chargers announced that they will leave San Diego for the LA area starting in the 2017 season. The Chargers have played in San Diego for 56 years. They will temporarily play at a stadium near Long Beach. Major, you are a San Diego native. You know the team pretty well.
Yes.
There's been a lot of movement in terms of football returning to Los Angeles. The Rams and the Raiders both used to be there. The Raiders are in Oakland, possibly moving to Las Vegas. The Rams went to St. Louis and are now back in L.A. Now the Chargers are leaving San Diego for Los Angeles.
So do the math. You said the Chargers have played in San Diego for 56 years. I'm 54 years old. Okay?
Oh.
So my sports-loving life is devoted in San Diego to two teams, the Chargers and the Padres.
Yeah.
And anyone who follows my Twitter feed knows that I have an abusive relationship with both teams. Now I only have that relationship with the Padres because I will not follow the Chargers to Los Angeles. And I don't think many fans in San Diego will. I know the owner of the Chargers, Dean Spanos. He considers me kind of a local boy who's made good. We've had long conversations about this. I knew 3 years ago this was likely to be inevitable. I was surprised yesterday how painful it was nevertheless. There is something disconcerting that pulls away from you a sense of your own place, a sense of nostalgia, a sense of being when you're a big-time sports fan, as I am. My son Luke and I are big Charger fans. When the Chargers lost, as they typically do one of their playoff games, we literally cried ourselves to sleep when he was about 8 or 9 years old.
Seriously?
Seriously, wow. Yeah. So it was... Everyone feels displaced when their team leaves. Many San Diegans I know are glad because the city stood up against the NFL and didn't put up more money than the city was comfortable with just to build a new stadium for a $1 billion industry and another $1 billion owner.
Which is also what a lot of Oaklanders said when the Raiders started asking for the city to pay to rebuild the Coliseum.
And I'm going to suggest this one thing. I think this might be a turning point for the NFL, its relationship to communities and the fans themselves. There's already rating issues around the NFL right now. Is it losing its centrality as a cultural aspect of American life? But there can be life without the NFL, and my hometown is going to prove how it goes about living that life. And the NFL better be cautious. It's walking into a market that does not have a deep financial affection for the NFL. It is a college football town defined by the USC Trojans and the UCLA Bruins. The Rams got off to a good start, but that stadium was more than 3/4 empty, the Coliseum, by the end of this football season. The Chargers will have very little fan base in Los Angeles. I know there's a lot of money and banks and personal seat license possibilities in L.A. Good luck and good riddance.
Wow. Strong feelings from Major Garrett. And you know we just freaked out a lot of NPR listeners who think we don't talk sports. So we have just torn the veil of the temple. I don't know if you know this, but we'll try to get back to politics right now.
Glad to be one of the shredders.
Thank you, Major. In our last few minutes of this program, just before we have to land this plane, there's been a lot going on in the news. Anything, Major, that we've missed this week that we should watch out for next week? In the heat around all of the confirmation hearings, Donald Trump's press conference, what are you going to be looking out for next week? Susan?
Well, my bias is certainly to look at what's happening in the world, the rest of the world and the rest of the country, and how it, plays back here in Washington. And, I've just landed literally this week from a short-lived stint in Jerusalem. And there the expectation very much is that the Trump effect is going to have real life consequences, not just Twitter consequences. And, people are braced for a decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem potentially. They believe there's the prospect for even a third intifada to break out. Certainly, there was a terror attack with a truck driven into a crowd of bystanders so close to the apartment where my husband and I and my son were living that as the movers were packing up our apartment, we could hear all the sirens. And I thought, this is a potential Trump effect that's very real world.
Very briefly, Jeff Mason?
I think just the events of Inauguration Week, the last few days of the Obama presidency, I'm sure that he will weigh in again on a few things. And I think watching how Inauguration Day plays out and the day after when there are some protests will be newsy and consequential.
Jeff Mason is White House correspondent for Reuters. Jeff, thanks for spending the hour with us.
My pleasure.
Susan Glasser, Chief International Affairs columnist at Politico. Susan, thank you.
Thank you.
And Major Garrett, the head coach of the Washington Shredders. Majorette now, the Chief White House correspondent for CBS
I'll
News.
take that title. I'll take that and run with it every direction.
Don't think I won't make you a jersey. Major, thanks for spending the hour with us.
My pleasure.
Remember to send us your stories about how a First Lady has affected your life personally. 855-236-1A1A or email a voice memo to 1A@WAMU.org. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. Enjoy your weekend. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Inada, Japanese maker of full-body massage chairs, including the Flex 3S, with pre-programmed shiatsu massages and full-body stretch sessions at inadausa.com. That's INADAUSA.com. And from Visit St. Petersburg Clearwater, home of 35 miles of white sand beaches along Florida's Gulf Coast, and a daily sunset celebration on Clearwater Beach, 90 minutes west of Orlando, at visitstpeteclearwater.com.
I'm Joshua Johnson. Next time on 1A, for many black families, the Green Book was a catalog of refuge and tolerance in an otherwise hostile world.
You traveled during the day, you tried to get to where you were going before nightfall.
Because the least little thing could trigger violence.
A guide to the Green Book, next time on 1A. Washington politics dominated the headlines this week. While all that was going on, what might we have missed around the world? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. Today on 1A, it's the international edition of the Friday News Roundup. We'll make sense of how this week's cabinet confirmation hearings and Donald Trump's news conference in New York might affect America's relationships with other countries. Outside the U.S., peace talks in Syria are getting closer, and Russia has been nervously eyeing what's going on next door in Poland. We'd love to hear from you. Share your questions about this week's top international stories. Email us 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. Washington politics have dominated this week's news, but there is a lot happening around the world that you should not miss.
Russia denies having any embarrassing information about the president-elect.
Moscow has blasted NATO's prepositioning of U.S. military hardware in Poland, saying it's a threat to Russian national security and an aggressive step.
As you can see, more people are pouring in to pay respect to the late Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani.
If you're driving an old car in Norway, you might want to invest in some CDs or cassette tapes, and probably soon.
There's a lot to talk about in this week's international edition of the Friday News Roundup. Joining me here in studio is Nancy Youssef, national security correspondent for BuzzFeed. Nancy, welcome to 1A.
Great to be with you.
Mark Landler is White House correspondent for the New York Times. He is the author of Alter Egos, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Twilight Struggle Over American Power. Mark, glad to have you.
Great to be here, Joshua.
And Yochi Dreazen is foreign editor for Vox and the author of The Invisible Front. Yochi, welcome.
Thanks, Joshua.
We welcome your questions and reactions to this week's international news. Email us 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. And you can watch the live video stream of this conversation online at the1a.org. That's the word the number 1, the letter a.org. Wore a tie for the occasion. Let's talk about the U.S. and Russia. It was one of the top domestic stories this week and also has, obviously, a lot of international implications. We have been learning more about the intelligence community briefing President Obama, President-elect Donald Trump, and Vice President Biden on an independently sourced intelligence report, supposed intelligence report, that claims to include information that Russia has that could be basically used to blackmail Donald Trump. Very few news organizations have reported anything about the details of the report. BuzzFeed published a PDF that it says was a copy of this document. Donald Trump has been blasting the press over even talking about this, and a number of the Senate confirmation hearings this week have dealt with Russia in a variety of ways. Mark Landler, what did we learn this week about what the U.S. relationship with Russia might look like going forward under the Trump administration?
Well, Joshua, it's complicated because President-elect Trump continues to say he wants to reset the relationship. He would never use that word, of course. That's an Obama word. But he wants to have a new, better relationship, and he reaffirmed that in his news conference the other day. But what's complicated is that a number of his own cabinet nominees for Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and CIA director have been much more skeptical and much more in line with traditional American thinking on Russia, which is that Russia remains an adversary. Russia had clearly a role in the disruption, hacking of the presidential campaign. And so all three of those nominees testified to that effect this week in Washington. So you have this interesting tableau of an incoming president being to some extent contradicted by his own choices for cabinet positions. Against that, all that is the backdrop of these unsubstantiated allegations about dealings that Donald Trump had with the Russians and potentially compromising information that the Russians have on him. And I've got to say, for a story with such potentially profound consequences, we still don't know a great deal. Most importantly, whether there's any substance to these reports, to these allegations. So I think what's happening is there's a sense of unease in Washington, but a deeper sense that we got to get to the bottom of these questions.
Nancy Youssef, what do we know in terms of security circles, not just in the U.S., but more broadly internationally, about how this kind of operation works? The word compromat has been tossed around a lot this week. Compromising information, a genteel word for blackmail, perhaps. Right. What do we know about how these kinds of operations work?
Well, what was fascinating is the genesis of this report, that this was crafted by a private security company originally for the Republican Party during the presidential campaign and eventually the Democratic Party, and that the man who was leading it, a Brit who was a former MI6 officer, Christopher Steele, couldn't actually go to Russia himself, and he was working with operatives there to try to put some of this information together. And from that, the report was crafted, in this whole idea that there's sort of an underbelly world of intelligence gathering by the Russian government and potentially against presidential candidates, and interest in someone who, if the report has any merit to it, was even a presidential candidate, that he was a target precisely because he was a public figure, a powerful businessman. And so in this effort, as Mark spells out, to figure out the truth in all this. We're kind of learning the way that things are being put together. I think at the heart of this is a question over why Trump is so eager to change U.S. policy on Russia. You know, when you hear him talking about changing the intelligence community apparatus and organization, you can trace the genesis of that. Mike Flynn, his incoming national security director, has had tense relations. We don't know where this thought process is coming from. And from that, as Mark referenced, we're having to piece together anything we can to try to understand what are the reasons behind his proposal, which goes against what his national security team is proposing and goes against longstanding U.S. policy.
Yochi Dreazen, Russia has, of course, denied that any of this information is real, that it had done anything like this. How is this playing out internationally? Not only in Russia, but perhaps more broadly, countries watching this U.S.-Russia controversy?
I mean, when you look at kind of foreign press, if you do just kind of an overview of the way it's covered in the European press, the Middle Eastern press, it's sort of with the same degree of horror/befuddlement as we all have. Like, how are we at a place in American history where this is being talked about? I think what's most interesting about the whole notion of Russia having compromising material is, what could they possibly have about Donald Trump that we don't know? We've heard him brag about his sex life. We've heard him brag about adultery. We've heard him brag about sexual assault. What do they possibly have? It strikes me that the thing he'd be most embarrassed about is about his money, that he's not as rich as he claims. Like, he's been so sensitive to anyone who says, you're not a billionaire. He went to court against a New York Times reporter and lost. But it's a serious question that I don't mean to sound glib, but what could they possibly have that is more embarrassing than what we already know? And I think ultimately the question is Nancy's question. Why is he acting the way he acts? Why does he believe what he believes? Why is he willing to call the intelligence community Nazi Germany? Why does he believe Julian Assange over the CIA? The question of not only why is he wanting to change U.S. policy to make NATO weaker, to lift sanctions on Russia, but more fundamentally, why does he trust Moscow and Julian Assange more than he trusts the CIA?
And really, in a way, it doesn't. I wonder if in a way it doesn't even matter. I mean, just the fact that there could be the intimation of these scandals and that we would even talk about it means that it's having an effect. We're talking about it, and it doesn't have to be true for it to be damaging.
Right. And if you're a person who's considering working with, the CIA, are you less prone to do so when you have the president saying that they're not to be trusted? I mean, the consequences, I think, will play out in the next months and years ahead as we start to see what intelligence operatives are willing or not willing to work with the U.S. Are you to believe intelligence gathering information when you have a president saying that they're not to be trusted? And so there's sort of the innuendo, and I think we have to watch now for concrete examples of harm to how the U.S. gathers intelligence and how other nations and other potential operatives are willing to work with the United States intelligence community.
That's Nancy Youssef, national security correspondent for BuzzFeed. We're also speaking to Yochi Dreazen, foreign editor of Vox, and Mark Landler, White House correspondent for the New York Times, on the international edition of the Friday News Roundup. We'd love to speak to you, too. What questions do you have? What are your thoughts about the week's news around the world? Maybe some of the gaps that we can fill in while we were all so busy listening to Donald Trump's press conference and so busy watching the confirmation hearings, we missed a lot. What can we help fill in for you? Email us, 1a@wamu.org, tweet us at 1a, or comment on our Facebook page. Let's talk about one of the U.S. military activities that Russia has expressed some concern over, which is in Poland. Russia says it views the arrival of more than 3,000 U.S. soldiers in Poland as a threat to its own national security. The troops are part of President Obama's response to reassure NATO allies who are concerned about a more aggressive Russia. It's the largest U.S. military reinforcement of Europe in decades. Mark Landler, has the Trump administration said anything at all about how it feels about this, or the Obama administration talked very much about this? This has been, I mean, obviously, because of the election, it's been hard to hear anything else, but what do we know about either the outgoing or the incoming administration and this maneuver?
Well, in the category, as Nancy was saying, of trying to figure out where Trump is on relations with Russia, this is a very unsettled issue. The president-elect has made very clear that he, in turning a new page, would probably resist these kinds of efforts. The Russians have struck back very hard at it and said it is destabilizing to them. And so they clearly view it as a very antagonistic move, one that Donald Trump based on everything he said, would be likely to reverse. Having said that, his own defense secretary designate and secretary of state have both talked about the need to, A, shore up the NATO alliance. Jim Mattis, his defense secretary nominee, said that Putin and Russia's goal was to break up the NATO alliance. And Rex Tillerson, his secretary of state designate, has said that the U.S. needs to use a proportionate response to pressure by Russia. So the two top national security officials in this incoming administration would appear on the face of it to be absolutely comfortable with a move like this. However, their commander-in-chief would appear not to be. And I think that's why there's a great deal of uncertainty around this. The NATO Secretary General seems to feel that the alliance is on solid footing and this is not going to be reversed, and perhaps he's right. But I think that it's we're in terra incognita here as far as the president himself.
Nancy, before we hit a break, what do you make of this?
Well, I think the deployment of these troops and whether the replacement troops, which are already being in the midst of training now, are allowed to continue, it's one of the most tangible measures of the Trump administration's relationship with NATO and how it sees Russia. If it allows this mission to go on, it is sticking to the traditional U.S.-NATO relationship. If it decides not to send that replacement brigade or more dramatically pull back those forces that just arrived, that says this administration is fundamentally changing the U.S. relationship with NATO and Russia.
I'd love to hear from you more on the other side of this break about where this goes from here, what the timeline is, what the urgency is, but we'll get to that in just a second. We're going to continue the Friday News Roundup with Yochi Dreazen of Vox, Mark Landler of the New York Times, and Nancy Youssef of BuzzFeed, and your questions and emails, 1a@wamu.org. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Hiscox Insurance, providing customized insurance for small and medium businesses so they can do more and be more. Learn more at hiscox.com or from an agent. Hiscox Insurance. Encourage courage. And from Constant Contact, with email marketing features like drag-and-drop editing and mobile-friendly templates. Constant Contact is committed to helping small businesses and nonprofits become marketers. Learn more at constantcontact.com.
It's the international edition of the Friday News Roundup on 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson, here with Yochi Dreazen of Vox, Mark Landler of the New York Times, and Nancy Youssef of BuzzFeed. We welcome your questions and thoughts about the week's news around the world. Email us, 1a@wamu.org, tweet us at 1A, or comment on our Facebook page, and you can watch the live video stream of this hour on our website, the1a.org. That's the word the number one, the letter A.org. Before the break, we were talking about this military exercise between the U.S. and Poland, with more than 3,000 U.S. soldiers headed there. Russia says it views that as a threat to its security. Explain for Americans who may not follow these kinds of things very closely why this should matter to us. So we're doing a big military exercise in Poland. So what?
So this is meant to be, in some ways, much more than an exercise. This is meant to be the kind of down payment on a much bigger plan. The idea is you'll pre-position more military equipment in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. You'll have more aircraft. You'll have troops there on sort of a permanent rotational basis, not all of which are American. But this isn't meant to be something where they just go and come back. This is meant to be something where they go, they leave, more Americans go, they leave. But there's like a permanent, much expanded presence in terms of troops, planes, equipment. And what's meant to say to the Russians is, we are in Eastern Europe, we are in the Baltics, you cannot come, you cannot cross, there'll be repercussions. If you like NATO, if you're a fan of NATO, the fact that this is starting before January 20th is the best news imaginable. Because once the military machine starts to roll, as people are trained and deployed and equipment is sent, it's much harder to pull back. If this had not started and Donald Trump was going to give the green light whether it should or should not start, that's much easier to do. He could still stop it, of course, but once the machinery of the military starts to move, it's a much harder thing than it would be to just have vetoed it before it had started at all.
So, Mark Landler, is this mostly a logistical challenge if President-elect Trump decides to pull some of these troops back in terms of our relationship with NATO, or is this mostly just political in terms of, well, the Obama administration did that, we're not going to do that so much?
I think it's both, but I would argue that it's not just a political issue. This is a very big issue in terms of establishing whether we're headed into, if you like, a new Cold War with Russia, which it sure looks like we were in the waning months of the Obama administration, and which we almost certainly would have had Hillary Clinton been elected. She would have been every bit as hawkish, if not more hawkish, toward Russia than President Obama was. Or are we actually going to make a major shift? And a shift, by the way, that has consequences not just in Central Europe, but in Syria and in other geopolitical conflicts where we're going to try to turn Russia into a partner rather than an adversary. So I would argue that this question of these 3,000 troops is in a way the tip of the spear for this much bigger question of what is our relationship going to be? Is this whole idea of a new Cold War truly going to be consigned very quickly to the dustbin of history? And I think, again, as I said earlier, I don't think we know the answer yet, because I think it's tempting to say that Donald Trump will follow through on everything he says, but we know that that's not the case. We've seen it already in the very early days of the transition. And also remember, every previous, or at least the last two previous presidents, both came into office hoping for a new start with Vladimir Putin. In Obama's case, it was with Dmitry Medvedev, his president. In George Bush's case, it was with Putin himself. And in both cases, the administrations felt in some ways betrayed and disillusioned by the end of it. So the question is, are we just going to repeat this cycle yet another time, or is this a fundamentally different calculation the U.S. is making?
And just to be clear, when you talk about Donald Trump already not following through on some of the things that he campaigned on, are you talking about things like, for example, the border wall with Mexico where he said Mexico's going to pay for it, and now it sounds more like a reimbursement than a payment? A
tax or something that'll happen much later. Yes, in fact, that's precisely what I'm talking about. Already some of the things he's said when they meet the reality tend to melt away a little bit. We haven't seen that yet on Russia. He's actually, as recently as his news conference, reaffirmed that he wants to make this a new start, and the fact that he's viewed differently by Russia, he said was an asset, not a liability. So he hasn't shrunk back yet, although it is worth noting for the first time this week, he acknowledged a Russian role in the hacking. So that's why I think we just need to take a great deal of caution in making assumptions.
Nancy?
I would just say in the immediate, the presence of those U.S. troops, and they're not just going to be in Poland, they're in 9 countries. They'll be spread out across Europe. Fundamentally alters, limits Russia behavior towards Eastern Europe. And that's, for those who think that the U.S. presence and alliance with NATO is important, is valuable.
Let's shift gears to Afghanistan. This week we learned that the U.S. Air Force dramatically increased the number of airstrikes it carried out in Afghanistan last year. Some see that as a further sign that the U.S. is increasingly involved in a war that a lot of people might have thought we left behind. This week in Afghanistan, at least 30 people died in 2 bombings near the parliament building in Kabul. 70 people were wounded in the 2 explosions. Yochi Dreazen, does this mean that the Taliban is resurgent? Does this mean that we have to go back and fight the kind of war that President Obama tried to pull us completely out of?
Yeah, I think the Taliban have never gone away, and we have never left, and it's not clear if we will ever leave. The Taliban have been steadily regaining territory for the last 4 or 5 years. In Helmand, where the U.S. is sending Marines back, where the Marines had lost a lot of people, I spent a lot of time in Helmand. The Taliban are estimated to control as much as 85% of the province compared to 20% a couple of years ago. So a major province of Afghanistan is basically controlled in its entirety by the Taliban. That's true of many provinces in the east. They have the ability to hit inside of Kabul. They have the ability to hit inside of Kandahar. So they can hit the major cities of Afghanistan. They can hit the rural areas of Afghanistan. They control territory. The U.S. hope now is not to defeat the Taliban. The U.S. hope is to in some way get them into the political process because it's a recognition they will not be defeated militarily. The best case scenario is something akin to what happens with Hezbollah in Lebanon, where they're a political party. They will maintain a militia. They will never disarm. But they move from something that's actively fighting to something where those forces are in reserve. And that's, at this point, what the U.S. hopes for.
Now, this week, the BBC reported that America's top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, criticized Russia and Iran for establishing links with the Taliban. Nancy Youssef, what do you make of that? Are Russia and Iran playing a very old game again, or is this something else?
Well, we've seen the increase of foreign fighters where there was just a few organizations that the U.S. was dealing with in Afghanistan. There is now more than a dozen, including the Islamic State. And so you're seeing outside influence throughout Afghanistan, and I think General Nicholson was referring to that. It also contributes to the growing instability in Afghanistan because the U.S. is not just confronting the Taliban expansion, but that of other groups that are having influence and battling in some cases against the Taliban. And so the talk of outside influence in a way has always been a threat, and increasingly so in the last year, and has contributed to the instability. That coupled with the U.S. that has, for the most part, tried to draw back its forces and put the Afghans in lead when it appears that they weren't really ready to confront this kind of complicated threat. If the U.S. struggled with the threat of 2001, 2, and 3, you now have a nascent force confronting far more security challenges within Afghanistan.
We have a listener who asked on Twitter if we could talk further about Russia's connection to the Taliban. Could we flesh that out a little bit more? Yochi?
I mean, Russia has at times been wanting to fight the Taliban, and at times been less hostile towards it. It's one of those areas where Russia plays a long game in Afghanistan. There are people in Afghanistan who feel nostalgia for Russia. They feel like when Russia was there, the cities were safe, even if the civil war was raging elsewhere in the country. The idea that Russia is directly arming the Taliban, to me, seemed ludicrous. The idea that Russia might allow borders that surround it, the republics that surround Afghanistan to have borders that are more porous than they might otherwise be, that seems much more realistic. The most realistic to me is that they're trying to get political leverage. They're trying to build political ties with the Taliban for a future deal down the road.
Speaking of Russia and Iran, that topic came up this week during one of the Senate confirmation hearings for General James Mattis, who is Donald Trump's pick to be the Secretary of Defense. Yesterday, in his confirmation hearing, he seemed to break with the president-elect on a number of issues, including Russia and Iran. Here's a clip of General Mattis responding to a question from Senator Jack Reed, who's the top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. General Mattis had been asked about the nuclear deal with Iran.
Sir, I think it is an imperfect arms control agreement. It's not a friendship treaty, but when America gives her word, we have to live up to it.
Mark Landler, what's that tell you about what the cabinet's relationship to the Trump administration might be as it relates to the U.S. and the world?
Well, I mean, it's one of the instances that I alluded to earlier where there was a very visible break between these incoming cabinet secretaries and their commander-in-chief. And it wasn't just on the Iran nuclear deal. It was also in the case of Rex Tillerson on the climate change pact. He said he would prefer to see the U.S. remain a part of the Paris Climate Accord because he wants the U.S. to have a seat at the table for these negotiations. In the case of General Mattis, what I found interesting about that quote was that language is very, very close to the way that the Obama administration has defended and portrayed the Iranian nuclear deal. Particularly more recently, it's made the point that this should not be viewed as a universal deal that changes our relationship with Iran, brings Iran in from the cold, makes Iran a potential ally or partner going forward. It is rather a limited arms control deal that applies to the nuclear program. It doesn't preclude the U.S. from pushing back hard on Iran for state sponsorship of terrorism, for interference in Syria, for any of the other things that we find objectionable about Iran. So again, the question is for Donald Trump. Does Donald Trump want to expend the political capital of ripping up this deal? A deal, by the way, that is also signed by Britain, France, Germany, the European Union, Russia, and China. So a complicated deal to rip up, since the other signatories to it are not likely to go along with the U.S.
Nancy?
Well, for me, what was interesting is I couldn't help wondering, after listening to Tillerson's remarks, Pompeo's remarks, and Mattis's remarks, given how much they seem to be on one side of the issue, particularly when it came to Russia and the Iran deal, and the president-elect, it had me wondering, what was the vetting process? What was the criteria? Now, General Mattis tried to deal with this by saying, maybe it's a good thing to have a team of rivals. The president-elect sent out a message this morning that said he wants to hear everybody's independent views. But you can already see a battle shaping up internally about how you rectify what one group feels within the administration versus another. And it just had me wondering, if they don't agree on fundamental issues vis-a-vis national security, and these are the top 3 nominees for the national security team, what was the basis that attracted these candidates to this president-elect to join his administration?
I'm curious also about how these things might play out around the world, especially in terms of the world beginning to realize what policy might look like under President-elect Donald Trump. This is a clip from Congressman Mike Pompeo, Republican from Kansas. He is Donald Trump's nominee to be the next director of the CIA. Congressman Pompeo was asked by California Senator Dianne Feinstein about some of the torture techniques that have become very controversial.
If you were ordered by the president to restart the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques that fall outside of the Army Field Manual, would you comply?
Senator, absolutely not. Moreover, I can't imagine that I would be asked that by the president-elect or then president.
Yochi, what do you make of that?
I can imagine that being asked by the then president-elect and soon-to-be president. Donald Trump on the campaign trail said he would bring it back. He'd bring back what he said was a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding. He walked that back after meeting with Jim Mattis, who seems to single-handedly have persuaded him over basically coffee at Trump Tower that was a bad idea. It would be difficult to do. The CIA does not want to do it. Their workforce does not want to do it. The Army Field Manual, which is now the kind of standard, would have to be changed for that to happen. It's unlikely to me that Donald Trump would order it. I also believe that Pompeo and the CIA would just resist because they saw what happened after they did it in the past. It was the darkest chapter in their history, one that still has repercussions for the history of the CIA going forward. But what was interesting to me about that hearing and about the Tillerson hearing, the Mattis hearing, John Kelly for Department of Homeland Security, it wasn't just that they broke with Donald Trump. It was that on many issues they said they had never talked about them with Donald Trump. Rex Tillerson was told, you've had this long conversation. I assume I'm assuming Russia was at the top of the list. And he said, no, we never talked about it. John Kelly was told, you've talked about the wall. I'm sure that's been a major part of your conversation with the president. We've never talked about it. So there's the question of the vetting. There's the question of how do you have people whose views are diametrically opposed? And then there's the question of how do you have a cabinet who have never even talked to their boss about the single most important issue of each of their departments? Yeah,
but is this just what you say to get confirmed? I mean, in terms of Mike Pompeo saying, I would absolutely never, or, any number of the other policy disagreements with the Trump administration, how much, Mark, do you think that they're just saying what they think the Republican establishment in Congress needs to hear to get them the job, as opposed to speaking their truly held beliefs?
Well, look, in the case of Rex Tillerson, there's no doubt that he is walking this extremely difficult line. Let's talk about Russia sanctions, for example. Exxon lobbied against sanctions on Russia. Exxon does a lot of business in Russia. Rex Tillerson tried to sort of suggest that maybe they hadn't really lobbied against sanctions. Maybe they were just consulting with lawmakers. The problem he has is if he reaffirms Exxon's position, he antagonizes Marco Rubio and all the hawks in the Senate.
Senator from Florida,
and potentially puts his confirmation at risk. If, on the other hand, he affirms his position, or rather comes out strongly in favor of sanctions, he then puts himself at odds with his own future boss, President-elect Trump. So he's in a very difficult position. I thought that Mattis, in some ways, was more honestly speaking his positions on a range of issues. I didn't feel there was a particular sense of conflict in Jim Mattis. He said what he believed on all of these issues. It sounded pretty much in line with where he's known to have been in his career. Maybe Nancy has a different view. But I felt that, that in the case of Tillerson, you saw just what Yochi was getting at earlier in rather dramatic display in that confirmation hearing. How are these contradictions going to be squared in the actual formulation of policy? And then the final point I wanted to make is you asked earlier, how do foreign countries look at this? On the one hand, you could argue foreign governments might be reassured. They might think, oh, okay, well, maybe the Iran deal doesn't get ripped up on day one. Maybe the U.S. doesn't pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. On the other hand, they've got to have a deep sense of unease that the U.S. government appears to be speaking with markedly different voices on these key issues.
Nancy?
And actually, we had a tangible example of that this week in terms of the deployment of U.S. troops to Eastern Europe, because you could hear the NATO partners breathing a sigh of relief when Mattis, the nominee for Defense Secretary, came out and said, I support this program. But because it's the president's decision ultimately, you could feel the push-pull of a sense of reassurance and at the same time an anxiety about whether Mattis's word will have enough sway to actually keep this very popular program in place. I just want to add about Mattis's testimony. At one point, Senator Elizabeth Warren asked him, on what areas will you give your most candid, frank advice? And he simply said, all of them. And so I think that speaks to his commitment to giving his frank assessment, and which comes from a man who, as a general, had that responsibility before the Congress. And
Spoken like a true Marine, for
Exactly.
sure. Yochi?
One of the other dynamics that I found startling, and these hearings were really fascinating. I mean, I don't want to speak for Mark or for Nancy, but having covered a lot of them, I've never seen anything quite like this, whether it's the macro of them disagreeing down to just some of the body language. But there's an interesting dilemma the Democrats have, which is they may not like the idea of putting somebody as recently retired as Jim Mattis into the Pentagon. They certainly may not like having Rex Tillerson be the face of the United States. But in the back of their minds has to be the question of, would the next person be worse? Would it have been worse to have Rudy Giuliani be Secretary of State nominee? Some of the other names that might have been at the Pentagon, would they have been worse than Jim Mattis? So they have to, on some level, swallow what might be legitimate concerns they have about these people because of the, oh my God, the next person could be so much worse.
There's plenty more to talk about in the international edition of the Friday News Roundup with Yochi Dreazen of Vox, Nancy Youssef of BuzzFeed, and Mark Landler of the New York Times. We'll get to some more of your questions as well, including some questions about a very important funeral that took place in Iran this week. We're back in a minute. Stay close.
Gregor Hens does not smoke anymore. Now he says he's a vicarious smoker.
Every form of cigarette ad gives me a pang of longing.
To deal with his withdrawal, he just wrote about it.
Every beautiful woman holding a cigarette between her fingers or just looking like she could be holding one.
I'm Kelly McEvers. Gregor Hens on his book Nicotine, later on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations. And from CarMax, offering more than 40,000 used cars and trucks online and in store, with over 150 locations from coast to coast. Learn more at CarMax.com. CarMax, drive what's possible. From Progressive, offering policyholders the option to bundle home and auto insurance coverage. Learn more at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. And from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping NPR advance journalistic excellence in the digital age.
Before we get back to the Roundup, we'd love your help working on a show that's coming up on Monday. The First Lady is technically an unofficial position, but it has played an influential role in many presidential administrations. How has a First Lady influenced you, personally? Perhaps it was her example as a wife or a mother, her advocacy on certain issues, her personal sense of style, her politics, or maybe something else. And yes, we are asking everyone this regardless of your gender. Tell us your story. Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. How has a First Lady, any First Lady, past or present, influenced you personally? 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also email a voice memo to 1A@WAMU.org. We'll play some of your stories this coming Monday on 1A. Back now to the international edition of the Friday News Roundup with Yochi Dreazen of Vox, Mark Landler of the New York Times, and Nancy Youssef of BuzzFeed. We've been getting a number of questions after we brought up the border wall with Mexico, to try to detail a little bit more of where that stands. And I understand that came up this week during one of the confirmation hearings. Is that right?
It came up a lot at the confirmation hearing for John Kelly, another of the retired generals that Trump is putting into his cabinet. He's a fascinating guy. He's one of the longest-serving generals in United States history. He'd been in the military all told for more than 40 years. He, like Jim Mattis, is not somebody who campaigned for this job or necessarily wants it. To your point from before, they can speak their mind more freely because if they don't get the job or if they're pushed out, they don't care. They're not craving to come in. But he was asked directly at the very opening of the hearing by John McCain about whether he supports the wall. And I just want to read you his quote because it was punchy and makes clear what he thought. A physical barrier in and of itself will not do the job. So do you believe in the idea of a wall? No. Then when he was asked to sort of delve into it a bit more deeply, he got into this very nuanced, kind of fascinating discussion about how there will be a flow of immigrants unless the stability, politically, economically, of Central, South, and Latin America improves dramatically. And unless that happens, he was saying immigrants will continue to come because we would continue to come if we were in their shoes and we felt unsafe or we had no jobs. It was a very nuanced, very humane way of talking about immigration, totally different than the way immigration had been talked about on the campaign, where it was hateful and toxic. He also was asked about a registry program that had been briefly used, then lain dormant, that would have allowed easily to the registration of incoming Muslim who, as they were getting visas, and there too said, I oppose any registry based on ethnicity or religion. So again, in a single sentence, saying that he didn't dance around it, he didn't try to nuance it, just bluntly, is it a good idea? No.
Mark?
For the reasons that Yochi just outlined, a lot of pro-immigration groups breathed a huge sigh of relief when John Kelly's name emerged for this job. If you recall, there was a big push to bring in far more anti-immigration types for this job. And so I think Kelly was viewed as actually a blessing. The one other point I wanted to make on this is that his last major command in the military was Southern Command, which oversees basically the Western Hemisphere, Latin America. So this is a commander who was steeped in issues of immigration and migration and has a very nuanced view of what are the root causes of it. And I think among pro-immigration groups, that was seen as very reassuring. This is a guy who really views immigration as a complex, multi-tiered issue, not in this kind of black and white Manichaean way that the Trump campaign presented it throughout the election.
U.S. Southern Command is based near Miami, right. And there's another issue in the news that definitely affects everybody in Miami that everyone was talking about hot and heavy this week, which had to do with Cuba and the wet foot, dry foot policy. Nancy, can you just give us an idea of what's happened? It sounds like this big shift in a policy that's been highly, highly controversial.
That's exactly right. This was something born in the 1990s during the Clinton administration, that if you were to migrate by boat, essentially at a time when you had a lot of capsizing and whatnot, that you would not be allowed, and if you came by way of land, that you would be. And in a very surprising move by the Obama administration, he announced the end of that Cuban refugees essentially would not be treated any differently than those from other countries. And so it caught everybody off guard. And what was interesting is there was a McClatchy News reporter on the border as the policy was changing and talked to the last people to come in, a 32-year-old man and a 7-year-old son, and they captured people coming by land from various countries like Mexico, in some cases walking in, who were by the thousands coming because they thought that the change would happen under President Trump because of his anti-immigration stance. And so that's how much it caught people off guard, this idea that in an instant, a policy that had really defined Cuban migration into the United States had changed under President Obama.
It was a policy also that angered a lot of people in Miami's Haitian and Haitian American communities because the feeling was, oh, so the Cubans get to play this game where if you make it to the border, you win, and if you don't, if we catch you at sea, we get to throw you back.
And it angered the Cubans as well because some would argue that it took a lot of the brain drain, if you will, out of Cuba as part of this enticement program, if you want to see it that way, to bring Cubans into the United States. So it was controversial all around. And for as you mentioned, if you were a Haitian or from another country, you might say, why not us? Why is it so different for the Cubans? And I think what the president was trying to do was to say, we're not going to treat Cuba differently. We have a new approach towards Cuba, and to have this policy suggests that there's sort of an asterisk towards that relationship, and that needs to end.
So this means that people, just on a practical level, to boil this all the way down to what it means for people on the ground, does this mean that people from Cuba, now that this policy is gone, if they want to come to the United States, they come in through the front door like everybody else? The exception is gone? What does this mean practically for people waking up in Miami on Monday?
It means that the easier path in that you had if you're Cuban is gone. So it used to be that if you arrived on U.S. soil, that in and of itself was enough to get you refugee status. That is no longer the case. Now the default will be you're sent back the way that anyone else arriving in the U.S. illegally might be sent back, unless you can make a credible case that you need asylum. So it basically, the way my colleague Dara Lind sums it up, which I thought was smart, is Obama's changing immigration policy on the way out the door, not to make it easier to come in, but to make it harder, which I think is not the way we often think about Barack Obama, but that is the practical impact of this.
Let's get to a few questions from the audience. Martin in Oak Island, North Carolina emailed us, Reagan had an extremely close relationship with Gorbachev. How is that any different than Trump and Putin?
Well, if I could just take a first stab at that, I mean, what Reagan was trying to do initially was antagonistic. He was trying to bring about the end of the Soviet Union, and he thought in Gorbachev he had a partner. Vladimir Putin is the literal exact opposite. He thinks that was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, that being the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wants to bring it back. These are not two men who are talking about getting rid of nuclear arms the way that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev did. Both of them, in the space of the last 2 weeks, have said their countries need to have better, bigger nuclear arsenals. So the philosophical approach these leaders have could not be more different. The practical approach, especially about nuclear weapons, which we don't talk about as much as we should, given how terrifying they are, could not be more different. There are reasons to hope that maybe there'll be some kind of relationship that's less terrifying than it now appears, but it won't be a Reagan-Gorbachev one.
As it relates to the nuclear arsenal, you're right, it is highly worrisome, if not terrifying. Have Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin said any of the same things about why they want the nuclear arsenals to increase? I mean, we have more than enough nukes right now to vaporize the surface of the earth many times over. Have they said anything about why this is in their or anyone's best interests?
Well, I mean, on Donald Trump's side, he hasn't laid out a sort of a coherent intellectual argument for why we need more nuclear weapons. He presents it very much in the same context that he makes many other statements. This is a display of American might. We're going to make America great again, and we're going to do it in the nuclear sphere, and we're not going to lay down for anybody. So I think he just presents it in that context. I wanted to make one other point relative to what Yochi said about Reagan, Gorbachev, and Trump, Putin. The other huge difference is Trump and Putin have a shared affinity for a kind of a strongman view of leadership. And I think it's fair to say, whatever you thought of either Reagan or Gorbachev, they just had such a different view of leadership and the role of leaders. And so I think that it's just not an analogy that makes sense on a number of different levels.
I agree. I mean, I think it's interesting that people are looking for some sort of explanation because we're entering a period where everything is so unconventional. And I can understand the need to sort of reach for some sort of historical reference, but I don't think this one's it.
Let's talk about Iran for a moment. One of the architects of the Iranian Revolution was laid to rest this week, the Ayatollah Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. Can you explain what exactly his significance was and what changes now that he's gone?
So he's someone who was kind of an Iranian version of like an old school Chicago politician. He was a wheeler dealer. He was thought to be spectacularly corrupt, even by the standards of the Middle East. He was also somebody who was remarkably smooth and maintained relationships both with the moderates in his country and with the clerical establishment, including Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, and with the military. So he was someone who managed to traverse pretty widely and pretty easily the divisions in Iranian society that we often don't talk about in the way that we should. He was somebody who was also seen as an ally of the current Iranian president, Rouhani, who will face elections in June. In some cases, who will have to defend the nuclear deal, which is as unpopular among parts of Iranian society as is among parts of American society. So in the same way that you've had Donald Trump say, I will tear up this deal on day one, Rouhani is saying he's trying to defend it, but many who are as powerful as he is, Khamenei, some of the others in the military establishment, are openly questioning whether the deal should survive. So Rafsanjani's death, this was the passing of a sort of an icon of the Iranian revolution. It's also someone's death who can impact the future politics of the Iranian country and government itself.
Vera emailed us a question about this. Vera asks, did the U.S. send a representative to the funeral of Rafsanjani to demonstrate support for moderate forces, especially President Rouhani? Is there hope the U.S. can help further moderation and keep the nuclear deal in place? Nancy?
So I don't know if they sent someone to a funeral, but they put out a statement. In and of itself, that was sort of interesting because that's something we haven't seen. One major Iranian figures, one who opposed the Shah, one who rose through Khomeini, died. So presumably they didn't send someone, but I can't tell you for sure. But the fact that they put out a statement really spoke to that this was a politician. Yes, he was the fourth president and was a former Speaker of Parliament, and yet he was unlike any other politician in Iran. He transcended lines there that others could not and was able to really shape the current administration and introduce moderates in a more prominent way. And I think his death really shocked those because he could do backroom deals. He could do things. He could say things that nobody else could.
Let's back up a bit to Rex Tillerson. Curtis asked us a question about the confirmation hearings. Curtis in Byron, Illinois wrote, Rex Tillerson was critical of Obama for not crossing his red line in Syria and for not having a stronger response to Putin in the Ukraine. Given that the U.S. House, the British Parliament, and NATO all declined to support a stronger response, what would Tillerson have done? Would he have had the U.S. military act alone? Mark, do we know anything about what Tillerson's view on that would have been? Has he talked about it yet?
He hasn't talked in any detail about that, and it's not clear what the U.S. In the case of Ukraine, now, it is fair to say, and some critics do, that President Obama's rhetoric could have been much tougher earlier on, and he could have tried to rally people more than he did. The red line is one of the most discussed and analyzed moments of the Obama presidency, and it's one where President Obama, I think, is more isolated than on many others in terms of arguing that not enforcing his red line still worked out well because he was able, with the Russians, to persuade the Syrians to hand over their chemical weapons. I think that a lot of foreign policy analysts would argue that even apart from that, the sort of collateral damage to U.S. credibility in the region and elsewhere outweighed any advantage to the U.S. of getting out those chemical weapons. So in a way, for Tillerson to knock Obama on the red line, that's an easy one. He'd find himself with a lot of company on that. For him to knock Obama on Russia and Ukraine, I think is a little more difficult because you did need the Germans and the Europeans to be with you in that, and they were simply not ready for a full-bore antagonistic response to the Russians. It's debatable whether Obama could have brought them to that point if he had tried harder, but he didn't.
There's a lot that went on this week in Washington and on Capitol Hill. A lot of other stories got kind of lost in the shuffle. I'm wondering if there's anything that you think we should be watching out for in the weeks and months to come that's on your radar early in the year. I have one that we saw that is a little more lighthearted, but I'm curious to know what you're going to be looking out for coming up in the weeks and months to come. Mark?
I'd say China, and it's not as though China's been ignored. President-elect Trump's call with the Taiwan president was certainly big news when it happened. But one of the interesting things that Rex Tillerson did say during his hearing was not only that the Chinese shouldn't establish more of a presence in the South China Sea, where they have all these military installations, but that they shouldn't be allowed access to the places they had already developed. China's state media blasted Tillerson for this just in the last 24 hours. And I think when you combine those statements with the well-documented strong rhetoric on trade that President-elect Trump has had toward China, that one of the looming potential crises for me is the United States and China.
Nancy?
I think the story that I'm watching most, because it's the region I care about the most, the Middle East, is Trump's call to move the embassy, the U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem, because
from Tel Aviv.
That's right, because we're already starting to see strong allies like Jordan and Egypt speak out against it. I mean, in terms of red lines, this is it for the allies in the Arab region, and we had Jordan call it a catastrophe publicly, which is something that they haven't done. His choice for ambassador seems very keen to do it, and this is something that I think really could change the Middle East and our relationships there, and it's something I'm watching very, very closely in terms of whether he goes through with it, how the allies react, and how an already unstable Middle East map and an alliance relationship with the United States changes because of it, what he does or what doesn't do.
Yochi?
A different part of Israel, which is the relationship between Bibi Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin. One thing that's fascinating is Arab leaders, Bibi Netanyahu, others in the region, the Turkish leaders, the Iranian leaders, who were once going to Washington when they felt like they needed mediation, are now going to Russia. And you've had sequences where you've had Netanyahu go see Putin, then within a week, the Iranians go see Putin. They see him as the person who can help restrain, potentially, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria. And you also have this, it's a fascinating unspoken alliance where what Israel really wants is for Bashar al-Assad to stay in power, as Putin wants, as someone in the United States would want, even if nobody admits it really publicly. And so this strange alliance of countries that don't normally talk, relationships you don't normally think of among leaders, who all want something that to much of the world is abhorrent, but is A, most likely going to happen, and B, what these countries deem to be in their best interest strategically.
I think your stories are very much worth talking about. We'll get to those in the weeks and months to come. I think definitely the embassy in Tel Aviv is going to be a big topic. The one that I found that I think is kind of interesting, and we'll end with this, is Norway is getting rid of FM radio. People, it's the end. They've gone crazy. But I understand exactly why they're doing it. FM is giving way to digital audio broadcasting in many parts of the world. On January 11th at 11:11 a.m. Norway time, they shut those stations off in favor of DAB radio, presumably to create more diversity in radio, which, of course, we like. But then FM radio, we got to have a few strongholds. I'm glad this program is one of our strongholds in the U.S., and I'm glad you helped me defend it. Yochi Dreazen, foreign editor for Vox. Yochi, thanks for spending the hour with us.
Thanks, Joshua.
Mark Landler, White House correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Joshua. It was a lot of fun.
And Nancy Youssef, national security correspondent for BuzzFeed. Thanks, Nancy.
My pleasure.
Remember, send us your stories about how a first lady has affected your life personally. 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. Or email us a voice memo, 1A@WAMU.org. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington. We are distributed by NPR. Remember to subscribe to our podcast feed on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find many more at npr.org/podcasts. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. Enjoy your weekend. This is 1A.